Professor Melville, I have between 8 and 10 questions on various topics. I should say all of these relate to your responsibilities for education and standards. I will not be asking you about fitness to practice proceedings, which are outside your area of responsibility within the GMC. Firstly, this. What patient involvement is there in the training of medical students?
A really important question, not one that I can directly answer because that is a good question to ask medical schools. I can say that for postgraduate curricula, in the development of a curriculum, we require that there is broad stakeholder engagement, and one of the explicit groups of stakeholders are patients. Maybe worth adding, sorry, while you're looking at your notes, that in the development of all our guidance, and I alluded to this earlier in connection with good medical practice, we are very keen to ensure that we hear the patient voice so that the guidance is relevant for patients as well as, from a patient perspective for doctors.
Who draws up the guidance? Is it just doctors within the GMC or is it a wider group?
No, and curiously, although we have 1,400 employees, the total number of doctors employed by the GMC is less than 20. So by far the majority of our employees are actually non-doctors. We have a council which is made up of 50% doctors and 50% non-doctors or lay representatives, 6 and 6 of each. But the guidance is largely drawn up by those who are experts in policy development, but it's done through the consultation process. So a draft will look at all of the evidence we've got, put together a framework as we did for good medical practice. It will then go out for public consultation, and we will look carefully at the feedback we get on the drafting of the document, including down to the choice of individual words.
When you were talking earlier about the consultation on good medical practice, you said that you have received feedback from hard-to-reach groups. Could you explain what those groups were and why you believe that you have been able to reach them with that consultation?
So I can't confidently say that we've reached everybody. I do appreciate that, but we used an external agency to seek to specifically identify. So, for example, patients or charities who are involved in rarer diseases, for example, people who come from sectors of society with protected characteristics. Are we hearing sufficiently from areas where there are high index of deprivation? So we have tried to ensure that we are hearing a range of voices and not just those who like to feedback to consultations. There is some analysis of that, and I'm sure that will be published in due course. I think we certainly will be presenting that to our council at their next meeting.
Returning to education, the question I'm asked to put to you is, should the contaminated blood scandal be used as a training example of what happens when openness and transparency are not part of the everyday healthcare system culture?
Of course, but it may not be the only example, and it would be for individual educators to determine which examples they use and how they're used.
Returning to guidance, how does the GMC update its guidance in light of major changes? And the example that I'm asked to put to you is the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Montgomery concerning informed consent.
Yes, so Montgomery is probably a well-known case. As it happens, our guidance wasn't out of compliance with the Montgomery findings, but whenever there is an inquiry or report made, we look at that to say, is our guidance compliant? Is there anything we as an organisation need to learn, and how should that be reflected in anything that we publish? So we have a team. It's within a group called the Regulation Policy Team, and they look at all the inquiries and the reports that come out from them to ask, what actions do we need to take, irrespective of whether there are specified recommendations for us to take action or not.
Is it possible to put a timescale on how quickly that can be done? For example, if in Montgomery you're your advice hadn't been consistent with Montgomery, how quickly could you have changed that?
So I'm trying to remember when the Montgomery...
It was 2011.
Yes, okay. And then there was a subsequent, I think there was something subsequent to that, but we would have to look at that in terms of the gravity, importance and impact, I think. So, you know, your earlier question about how quickly can we change guidance. If there was something that was... So if our guidance was not compliant with law, for example, then we would need to make that change as quickly as possible, whilst checking with our other guidance that it wasn't creating something unexpected. So it would depend on the level of importance of the information. That sounds like, I'm not trying to be defensive in that, I'm just trying to be honest and say it's not always easy to give an absolute answer to these things.
It's a very open question and a purely hypothetical one, so I understand the difficulties in answering it. The next question I'm asked to put to you is that in the evidence that you've given, there was some discussion about the language in the good medical practice, and the difference between must and should. Would you expect training on guidance to include an understanding of how language is used in such documents?
Yes, I mean, interestingly, we are looking at a slightly different way of presenting some opening statements within the new version of good medical practice, and these were consulted on. So there is a series of what we call I will statements. So it's rather than you must, it's I will, so that there's a sense of ownership. My recollection is that there was no particular pushback on that, so I would expect that to appear in the next guidance next year.
The question that I asked you about bias and include whether the training and education includes listening to female voices, particularly about female pain. Could you confirm whether the training, so far as you know, does include specific reference to listening to female voices, for example, about female pain?
I can't confirm that because I don't have any knowledge of it, but I would imagine that a group like the College of Obstetrics and Gynecology may be better placed to answer that in terms of how it's built into their curriculum.
In terms of guidance, both GMC guidance and wider clinical guidance, the question I'm asked to put to you is, how are busy medical practitioners to keep up with the changes in guidance, given the other demands that they have on their time?
We don't produce guidance every day or even every week, so our periodicity is not short. So in that sense, I think I've never thought that it wasn't manageable to accommodate guidance coming from the GMC, just speaking personally as a clinician. And we always publish any changes 6 months ahead of implementation, so there is an opportunity for every doctor and indeed medical students to become familiar with the guidance before it's due to be implemented. So we don't publish it and expect it to be used the same day.
To take an example, if you were to issue or reissue that guidance on the duty of candour, the joint guidance with the National Midwifery and Nursing Council, would you expect every doctor in the country to read the revised guidance at some stage?
I think I would hope so, because, I mean, it may depend on how it's changed. So often when we do send out information to doctors, bearing in mind that at the period of the inquiry there was no internet and no electronic communication, we now have a system of news for doctors, news for responsible officers, news for students, which are sent out electronically, and where we need to signal particular items, we would include a link to them within that message, and we can track what we call the click-through rate to say how many people engaged with that. So I would expect for something like that, I would hope we'd get a very high engagement rate. I can't then say whether they actually read it but have gone to it. But I would also expect in that circumstance our key guidance will be picked up by those involved in education and employers, to ensure that it's implemented and embedded within practice.
Would your outreach team also be put to work to try to engage people with the new guidance?
Yes, reflecting that they are a relatively small group of people, and we've, as I said, 300,000 registrants, but they tend to work at either medical school level or trust. We have 40 medical schools now and over 200 trusts in England alone, so you can imagine that it's not an easy task. We have also done some targeted work where we're either targeting on the basis of topic or theme, or in a geography or a place where we have particular concerns that we're seeking to support change.
Would the GMC produce, for example, teaching guides to be provided to employers and medical schools as to how to engage people and discuss the new guidance with them?
So we're not a... Teaching guidance for me is about a curriculum, or albeit small. We're not a curriculum provider, but we do produce case studies on topics, and there are many case study examples within our standards and ethics, for example, on our website. So those are accessible. I have to say that one of the questions we've been considering around the implementation of the new good medical practice guidance is, how do we work to see it embedded and implemented? What can we do? Because the take-up rate on our website is not that high. I mean, I can't say how common that is amongst other organisations, but we are trying to consider how we can best make sure that the messages get across.
Penultimate question. Have you, the GMC, had much interaction with the new National Guardian and her office?
Do you mean Henrietta Hughes? I'm trying to think what her title is. The Patient Safety Commissioner?
No, the
Guardian of Safe
National
Working.
Guardian's office.
So there's the Guardian of Safe Working. We do. I can't say to you it was on such and such a date, but we do have, and we work both with the Patient Safety Commissioner and with the Guardian's office and with other regulators where we can, to share information both in bilaterals and in group meetings.
A sub-question to that. Is there any prohibition on you sharing information with such bodies if you have concerns about a particular dean of a particular medical college, for example? So anything that could stop you passing that information to others?
Only the caveats around confidentiality and any potential legal implications. So we have our own in-house legal team who would advise if we thought there was something we needed to raise and we thought there was some sensitivity around it, we would either find a way to raise it, potentially anonymously, but we have powers within education to be able to intervene, but that doesn't necessarily mean we would disclose full details to another agency.
And that would be governed by the common law and the relevant statutes?
Yes.
Final question then. Do you have any views on whether placing the duty of candour on a statutory footing has made it more effective?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, I was expecting something slightly different at the end. I beg your pardon.
Do you have any views on whether placing the duty of candour on a statutory footing has made it more effective?
So at the moment, the duty of candour is a professional duty rather than a statutory duty. The risk, as we see it, for it being a statutory duty or a legal obligation is that it may drive behaviours around fear, which could reduce openness and disclosure rather than encourage it. In other words, our view is that we should be positive about encouraging openness, honesty and candour rather than threatening someone who doesn't. Our genuine belief is that that would not be a helpful way forward, but I fully appreciate that there will be individual patients and members of the public who will feel strongly differently because of the sense of we should hold people to account. I agree with that, but I think that's best done in a learning and future-facing way rather than a penalty and sanction way.
Just so that we're clear on this, I think, and it's my fault for not placing the question in context, there is a statutory requirement of a duty of candour on organisations.
Yes.
But when you were saying there that it's a professional duty rather than a statutory one, you are talking about individual doctors.
Yes.
And your answer there is that your feeling is that it is better left as a professional duty rather than as a statutory one.
So I think there is, in my mind, there is a subtle difference between a statutory obligation on an organisation and a statutory obligation on an individual, whether that be a clinician or non-clinician. And it's always been our position that it would be better to encourage openness through a professional duty than it would be through a statutory expectation on individuals.
And again, if I may put the question slightly more widely, do you see progress being made in the way that individual doctors are approaching the duty of candour?
So if you look back, I mean, we almost have to do this through time lapse, don't we? So if we look back over many years, in the generality, I think there has been a step change, that there is a greater sense of openness. But that is not quite the same as saying that every doctor is willing to be completely open. And I think some of that comes down to the fear and consequences point. And it's how we encourage, which is part of what the Health and HSIB, the Health Safety Investigation Branch, their role is focused on learning and seeking to maintain anonymity. Now, some people have strong views about whether that's the right way forward, but the principle of seeking to be understanding what happened rather than who did it and how we learn and how we change does seem, both to us and to me as an individual, a more positive and helpful way forward rather than a more, if you like, threatening approach if you don't.
Those are the questions that I have from the call participants. I turn to you, sir, to see if you have any.
Yes, I do. Can I just pick up on that last exchange with Council about the duty of candour on organisations and the view articulated by you on behalf of the GMC that it is thought that it wouldn't necessarily help openness amongst doctors. An organisation, I begin with this, an organisation can only act, can't it, through individuals. So in order to act, that individual has to know what might have gone wrong. How does an organisation know what might have gone wrong in the treatment by an individual doctor of an individual patient without the individual doctor telling the organisation?
Yes. This feels like the RO conversation, doesn't it?
Well,
no. So let me see if I can help. So a professional openness seems to me that there are two levels of issue. One is the individual responsibility to be open and honest, and the second is how the organisation responds when they are given the information about something that's happened. So there have been, as I understand it, there have been cases where at an organisational level it's perceived that there's been a cover-up, but not necessarily at an individual clinician level. And I think I was just trying to make a difference between that. So I think encouraging individuals to be open and honest is absolutely the right way to go. The question then is whether an organisation as a whole should be held to account. And they are made up of individuals, but they also have an organisational statutory position. So I was trying to just differentiate those two.
Well, I think I see the point of distinction you're making, and thank you for that. The second question, again, arises out of what may be seen as semantics, but let me just take you back to the very first question that you were asked after the break, where you spoke about the change, proposed change, to from you must to I will. The idea being that I will takes ownership. I just wonder whether there would be anything wrong with I must. The reason for that, for asking you that, is it might be said that it is the I rather than the you which gives ownership, and will expresses a future aspiration, whereas must expresses an obligation.
I was going to say, did you respond to the consultation? But perhaps that's unfair. So as a point of clarification, the I will statements are at the frontispiece. The choice of you must and you should in the text will still exist.
So
I didn't make that
So,
clear.
it's, right. In that case, that squares the circle. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Well, it's necessary to understand your evidence,
Yes,
really, on that.
I fully appreciate that point.
And the third question is this, really, taking me back to some of the evidence I heard right at the start of our evidence taking orally in this inquiry, and for that matter, in writing. Quite a large number, very large number, of those infected and those who were reporting on behalf of those who were infected, if they were no longer able themselves to do so, described the terms in which they had been told of their infection and its consequences for them. And the picture that very many painted was one of a brief, fairly terse, sometimes brutal, sometimes blunt conversation, which to those listening might have seemed to lack a degree of humanity, if that's not an understatement. I can well understand how a clinician who may think that they are responsible themselves for the suffering of an individual because they gave them, albeit in good faith, let us suppose, the drug or product responsible for the suffering which has now emerged, might feel awkward about it. But these conversations must take place on a number of occasions. Breaking bad news is a way of describing them, perhaps. How do you see the education which is overseen by the GMC and which is advocated by you on behalf of the GMC addresses problems such as that, which are, to an extent, reflections of personality which differs and has to be expressed on different occasions to very different people who are listening?
Yes, so in the process of, I'm going to call it training in communication skills, one of the things that comes across is about how, not what. So it's how you say something, how you communicate. So that idea of being compassionate and empathic in the way that is done is built in to that communication training. And I would hope, again reflecting on my own career journey, that our understanding and sense of empathy, of seeing it from the other person's perspective, is helping people to approach that communication, whether that's specific to this inquiry or in other contexts of breaking bad news. And one of the areas that the GMC has been looking at more generally is about creating compassionate cultures and also compassionate leadership, so that we are much more cognizant of the impact and concerns that individual patients may express. And I think that's come out in other inquiries as well. Culture is not always an easy thing to change. I often use the definition that says culture is determined by the values and behaviours of a group of people. And that means that we are all part of how we create the culture, whether that's for the family or the organisation we work for. And therefore we can all be part of it. It's not just about, but it's also important that the leaders of organisation set the tone for how that organisation will work, and how, in particular in the context of health services, how they will interact with patients and relatives. I would hope that I don't think we've used the word paternalism this afternoon, but that has been a view expressed of a lot of how healthcare was conducted in the past. I am not for one moment suggesting that has gone completely. It comes back, I think, to Council's comment on crustiness. But I am encouraged by some of the changes we've seen in the way education is supported. That means I hope that we are developing a much more compassionate group of healthcare professionals in a way which can more effectively communicate difficult conversations with patients and relatives.
So your use of the words such as looking at and developing suggests that we're on the road to getting to the ultimate destination, but we haven't actually got there quite yet, at least not sufficiently to satisfy those who might wish for a first-class result. What else could be done to help?
So I agree with you that the question is always how far have we got along that journey, and it's perhaps a little bit difficult to judge, and with no disrespect to any individual person, individual stories where it has failed signal that the problem still exists, but doesn't give us a sense of how much more we have to do. For our part, we're involved through our outreach team in delivering these programs of professional behaviours and patient safety, but we're also working with a whole host of other organisations, including the education bodies, the Royal Colleges, in how we can, and the medical schools, in how we can promote a more positive, empathic, compassionate culture for care.
Is there anything specific that can be recommended as a help for the future?
I think it perhaps is to pick up on where we know that there are problems and how we focus attention to help organisations in perhaps even understanding that their organisation is seen in that way, and then how that can be changed. As we can't do all that, but we can work with other partners, and if that becomes a recommendation, we would clearly want to take that forward with relevant partners and relevant stakeholders to deliver that. And I think one of the things I've learned is how powerful a patient voice can be. So I have heard, for example, James Titcombe, who I know, talk about his own experience from his past, and actually that's not always easy, but it can be a really helpful and engaging way of illustrating the extent to which we have not properly understood the concerns of patients. So I think the patient voice would be really helpful in this.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's all that I have to ask.
So then all that remains is to ask Professor Melville, as we ask all of our witnesses, if there is anything else that he would like to add to his evidence.
Not specifically, but to repeat what I said at the end, this has obviously been a very difficult journey for patients and their friends and relatives, and if anything comes out from your report for which we need to take action and how we can learn from it, we absolutely want to do that. Thank you.
Well, for my part, thank you very much for describing to us where we are at in terms of the GMC and education and appraisal and the like. It's been most useful.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, sir, we have Professor Neuberger, Professor Bellamy and Dr. Cave focusing in particular on hemovigilance and the processes that are in place for reporting incidents and adverse consequences of the use of blood and blood products.
Thank you. So 10 o'clock tomorrow.